Welcome to the show. This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 61. My name is Dominic. I am one of the co-hosts. The other co-host is Janus, and he will be here shortly. Today we have the pleasure of speaking to Mr. David Pantano. David is an independent researcher, translator, historian, and writer specializing in spirituality, metaphysics, philosophy, and the initiatic practices of East and West. He is the author of The Magic Door and is the translator of the book The Hermetic Physician. We're going to jump right into the episode, but before we do, I just want to say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. You are helping to keep the lights on here and ensuring that the show continues forward. If you would like to partner with us and help with this project, feel free to jump onto Patreon and do what you can. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius, and may any merits that we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings so that they, together with us, may equally realize awakening. Okay, we are here with David Pantano. We're very excited. We've got a lot to talk about. Foremost is the Hermetic Physician, his new book, or his new translation of a book by Marco Daffi. So we're going to be talking about Italian Hermetic practices, healing arts, and I'm sure all sorts of other things. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here. I look forward to a really engaging discussion with you guys.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. This is going to be good.
Yeah, so David, as we usually do, if you don't mind, would you mind, that's repetitive, if you don't mind, would you tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, how you got into this kind of work, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, yeah, sure. And this is always like the hardest question to answer when you have to talk about yourself. But I consider myself an independent scholar, historian, researcher, translator. I speak, I went to school at college university in the Latin languages, so primarily French, Spanish, and Italian, and involved in, or my interest in Hermeticism goes back to my youth when I was a sprawling, wide-eyed adolescence around 14th, where I was introduced to the works of Machiavelli, and I read The Prince, and I wasn't really impressed. And I go, this guy's, I think there was a deodorant called the Machiavelli or Prince Machiavelli or something like that. And so I went to the library and I read The Prince, and I wasn't that impressed by that. So his second book on the dialogues of Titus Livy, where he explains the workings of history and what you can learn from it, the loss from it, and it really gave me a sense of how Rome became great, and that in itself was a really eye opener, and it gave me a love for the classics and I guess of this branch or this current of wisdom which is like the Greco-Roman, and I was mentioning to earlier guys, it really spawned my interest in a particular period of the Renaissance where Hermeticism and Neoplatonism was revised. Through the works of a scholar called Marsilio Ficino, who was under the tutelage of the ruler of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, to translate the recently discovered Codex of Hermetic books, which was 15 at those times. And And from Ficino, there was a great lineage that went to Giordano Bruno, Tommaso Campanella, all the way up to about the 1600s. It's one of the last books on this tradition called The Magical World of Heroes by Cesare de Rivera, which Julius Evola translated and published in the last century. And from there, it really ended with the Cartesian revolution of rationalism, where things that weren't explainable or that didn't have a 3 dimension to be verified were of the fantasy. So a lot of the metaphysics, a lot of these Hermetic and Neoplatonic content and currents of thought just sort of went dormant. And there was an underground movement to keep it in line, specifically in Naples, by this writer called Giambattista Vico, who wrote a number of works, the most famous being The New Science, and where he really took to task the limitations of Cartesian thoughts of the mind, that we are our mind. The mind is just one component of our being. It's not the first or the outmost. It's more of a symptom than a cause. And there was this underground current that continued to flourish in Italy among scholars, among independent researchers of Hermeticism. And as I was mentioning earlier, really my discovery in the 1980s with an author, a notorious author called Julius Evola, who really brought this type of Hermetic thinking back to life, or at least to the forefront, in a very rigorous scholarly manner, with his books called The Hermetic Tradition, the Group, the 3 volumes, the Yoga, the Yoga of Tantra, his books on Buddhism, on alpinism or mountain climbing. So there's a whole range. He really helped to light imagination that this current didn't die in the 16th, that it was still revived. And through Evola, I became aware of this really thoroughbred Hermeticists, not only in theory but in practice, like Giuliano Kremmerz and Marco Daffi, Arturo Regini, and the Hermeticists that I was in touch with from Genova, called Gian Maria, who died last year, sprite age of 95 years old, who wrote about 30 books as well. And from that, that material, or that lineage, I was able to put together my first book called The Magic Door, the study on the Italic Hermetic tradition, which traces the history, or the lineage, from the mythical foundings of the Golden Bow to the classical Roman era, and then afterwards to the contemporary scene, that some of the names I just talked about. And from that, I wrote and translated a work by Kremmerz on a number of his material that's focused mostly on the history of the Miriam, which was the Isaic or a lunar type of order that he developed, or that he founded in the late 1800s, as a means for those who are interested in Hermeticism to take their theory into practice, and focusing on healing, which was a very traditional method to develop Hermetic and metaphysical powers through the art of healing, through the Asclepian art of healing, and is also a means to tame one's beast, one's egoistic tendencies. Is that you heal other people, you go outside of your principious individualness to realize that these theories and these practices are universal, and it's a spiritual science that they can be validated and confirmed in real life settings. So, and one thing to another, going to Rome in 96 and meeting authorities of this current, and getting an internal or inside information on the practice helped to further develop my knowledge. And here we go. And I've done a number of other translations and other works as well that will be coming out soon as well. That'll continue this tradition.
Well, that's great. No, so you're definitely a scholar. I get a hint that you're a practitioner too from some of the things you said. Would that be an accurate assumption for me to make, or would you prefer to remain?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, and however you want to define that, leave that up to the listeners and to yourselves, but definitely to know something, you have to be it, or else it's all just theoretical mumbo jumbo. And it's not my personal equation just to talk in the speculative mode. It's basically to confirm for my own for my own understanding theorems that resonate with me and that have a practical application. So very much so interested in the practical applications of these theories and doctrines and ideas that I write about and that which I'm interested in as well.
Now, Kremmerz, I mean, he was like a living legend in his time. I mean, when it comes to healing, this guy actually healed people. This guy actually did what, he walked the walk. He wasn't just, writing a bunch of bullshit mumbo jumbo.
Yeah.
He was going out there and putting the esoteric techniques into practice.
Yeah, and I think one of the great thing about the book, The Hermetic Physician by Marco Daffy, who knew Kremmerz, who was probably the leading light of that tradition after Kremmerz died, was that he wasn't afraid to give credit where credit due, but also to expose some of the negative aspects of the practice and of the doctrine, the lack of organizational structure, the hierarchy that was put in place that led to almost taking on a Masonic component where, the leaders of various academies or of various Hermetic chains wanted to be treated like they were like miracle workers. And, Daffy says these in itself are counterproductive. The real Hermetic physician doesn't go about, wearing rings and publicizing themselves. The proof is in the pudding. And Kremmerz was that. It was definitely one who was reserved on the outside, but inside had this wealth of knowledge. It's just he didn't have to. He was both gifted in terms of his ability with the pen, but also with the wand to heal people as well. There are a number of eyewitnesses and firsthand accounts of how his practices were able to turn really significant cases where people were given up by conventional medicine, and that using his knowledge of understanding the karmic retributions or implications of an individual who was undergoing some difficult times to understand how to read the underlying causal and not just the symptoms, which is what for the most part conventional medicine addresses, and with his knowledge and experience and the various education he did both in conventional medicine but also in some of these hermetic medicines, allowed him to develop some experimental modes to treat people in non-conformist manners, but also to help them. And his record really stands for itself in terms of the testimonies of the number of people he helped to heal or reduce the pain.
Nice. And just for those listening, we're talking about Giuliano Kremmerz. So maybe let's take a step back for a second. Let's talk about who he was, where he came from, who were his teachers, what were his sources.
Sure. So Kremmerz was born in a small town south of Naples called Portici, and from a very modest family. In the family there was an older gentleman without a family who lived in their house, and he was an initiate in a secret order called the Egyptian Order. And his name was Pasquale de Servis, and his Hermetic name was called Izar. And Izar was very strong in astrological and Hermetic healings. And the talk on the street was that he initiated Kremmerz and Kremmerz is a pseudonym. His birth name is I just forgot it now.
Ciro
Formizano. Thank you. Thanks. And so Kremmerz was initiated in the Hermetic practices at a young age. And I think, as it mentions in the book, that it was in the 1880s when Izar was still around, there was a huge cholera epidemic in Europe, and specifically it hit the Naples region hard. So similar like what the world went through a couple of years ago. with COVID, and Kremmerz was talking with his master Izar about wanting to put these hermetic practices to use to help people for good causes, for beneficial ends. So he had in his mind to set up this lunar type of order called the Miriam, based on the divine feminine archetype of the Maria. And there were other examples of religious orders that use similar type of prayers and so forth to help people who are going through hard time, even those who had recently departed. So I'm sure that those confederations of religious orders, the confraternities, were a big factor. There were also, when he was young, Kremmerz studied magnetism and mesmerism, how to tap into frequencies, to be able to project those to store and project those frequencies to help those, because most people who are sick are lacking vital energy, and those who undergo these practices live ascetic life, develop a greater amount of life force, of vitality, and the ability through practice to project those energies of those who have an abundance to those who are lesser would help to bring a level of homeostasis, of balance and equilibrium to those afflicted with infirmities. So that was really the nascence of the Miriam as based on the mystery traditions of Isis and Asclepius, where those in the past, in ancient, in classical Egypt and Greece and even in Rome, where sick individuals would go to a healer and they would put them in a trance or a dream state and really work with their astral body. So they're not their somatic body, the body that we're in now that we relate to with external senses, but the internal body of the opening up your energetic centers. And that was more available for healing because the laws of gravity are less in that more fluidic state. So it was much open to go to the root of the affliction and to channel energy. And the Miriam based on collective energy. So it wasn't just one healer, it was a number of practitioners who would practice this daily ritual and other rituals according to certain celestial alignments to build up this level of purity where they could become like batteries to be able to store and project these collective beneficial energies to a focal point, which is typically a healer, and then the healer would send that projected to the afflicted individual based on the prescription that was identified. And there is it's a pretty complex process, so I won't go into all the details, but it wasn't meant to be it could be a therapy in and of itself, but it also could complement more conventional methods, such as what doctors would prescribe or homeopathic practitioners would prescribe as well, as long as there was a harmony in terms of the various prescriptions, that this energy type of healing, this distant healing, would seen from Kremmerz is to assist those who are in need with other methods that weren't in itself sufficient to heal the afflicted individual. So I'll leave it as that. If you want me to go into any further details, I'd be happy to. I just don't want to run off to a tangent without answering your question in terms of how he got involved with it. So definitely through his master Izar, who is a specialist in these therapies, and Izar was part of this ancient order of mystics called the Egyptian order, that was connected to this Iseum, this Isaac temple that was in Pompeii, and that there, with the destruction of Pompeii through the volcano, and in the 1600s, there was some excavation, and they found some in the excavation the temple of Isis, but also some manuscripts. and the manuscripts became part of the archive of this great Egyptian order. And there were a series of different, I guess, leaders of this current throughout history that specialize in various areas of this Hermetic tradition. So there are a number of different leaders, such as you may have heard of Cagliostro, and the head of the Egyptian order at the time of Kremmerz was this highly developed initiate called Giuliano M, and he was head of the great Egyptian order, or the order of the Orient of Egypt. There were 12 members, and they oversaw various initiatic groups, such as the Rite of Mizraim, the Rite of Memphis, the Rite of Memphis and Mizraim, and they provided a number of charters, and they were in connection with other initiates throughout Europe, like Elena Blavatsky or Rudolf Steiner. They were all initiated. There was a famous book called by Bulwer Lytton that was written in the 1800s, and apparently he was initiated in called Zanoni. The book was called Zanoni, and apparently he was initiated into the mysteries of this of the great Egyptian order.
Well, it's interesting too, because as far as I understand, even these other orders like Memphis, Mizraim, things like that are still an outer order to the Egyptian order. They're still an outer form. Like the Masonizing influence is a later accretion that is actually, it's actually somewhat alien to the core, which is inherently Mediterranean, almost in an aboriginal way of like that synthesis between the Greek and the Egyptian and the Italic traditions.
I mean, Masonry in itself is just a vehicle, to be honest. And the Mizraim in Memphis, my knowledge of it, it's much more of a spiritual and based on Hermetic principles than some of the other rites of Freemasonry, like the York Rite or even of the Scottish Rite. So there were convergencies, and you're right, it's an outer order to basically to recruit the candidates who show potential to some of the more internal practices like the Miriam. But the Miriam itself is a lunar or is Isaic practice. Those who are considered or who develop a level of powers and of purity are able to get initiated to a higher order, which is the Osirian order, which was another order that recruited from the Miriam itself. And they were more on internal alchemy than on therapeutic healing, which is, again, lunar. It's basically taking these cosmic energies or earth energies and being a conduit. And from that, there are correlative developments of your own psychic and psychic powers and purities. And those who are at an Osirian level have already reached that stage. It's like channeling them to go higher in the initiation.
Kind of sounds like to me with the E61 work, you're acting as a conduit or a step down transformer for transpersonal astral forces to use them in transference into the bodies of the recipients in order to effectuate change.
Yeah, well, I think you said it very well. The only thing I would add to that even though you are a channeler of these energies, you never lose yourself. Your core being, your identity, with your what they call the numan, which is the root of who you are. You realize that the soul is connected to this universal spirit, and from that there are various currents of energy that one can tap in without being absorbed into the greater whole and losing one's individuality. And that, I think, in my experience or my understanding, is one of the flaws or one of the difficulties that neophytes have to develop, is that they're too easy to let themselves be taken over by these forces, not being able to synthesize them and to harness them and to project them for their own use or for the use of the purpose of the order that they're initiated in.
So, this, you raise an interesting point here, though, because this makes a distinction with, say, other initiatic magical or religious practices where there is that transmission, but it turns into a form of possession where the person becomes unconscious and exterior spirits enter them and operate through them without them even being aware of what's going on. Here, it sounds like you're describing actually a strengthening of the core self as a transmitter. It almost seems like the numan, like you said, or the daimon would have to be strengthened in order to be able to handle the amplitude of the psychic force transmitted to be effective.
I'm not quite sure about the second part of your description, just in the sense that to get to the numan or the daemon as you use, you need to peel away the layers of yourself. So rather than fortifying what you think is your numan, which just reinforces your egocentric self, is that you peel that all away. And that what's left is just the kernel, the light of consciousness. And that in itself doesn't really have any qualities, or it's your core. It's a transpersonal self, and that itself is just the basis of your identity and your tradition. So without trying to build superstructures or accretions onto what you think is your daemon, which in a sense just hiding your egocentric self. It's sort of like you want to get that all away, and just what is pure consciousness is the core of who you are. So when I say pure consciousness, you're aware of everything as consciousness, but you're also aware as yourself is a figment of that consciousness as well, and that's your individuality. So in this tradition, you don't lose your individuality. So for example, in Shaivism or some of the other Hindu traditions, is that the final stage, you integrate with the all, right, with the Brahman, and then you extinguish yourself. In this Italic, I call it the heroic tradition, you don't extinguish the root. So in a lot of the Eastern traditions, they negate the very existence of the soul. They say it's part of a part of the illusion, part of Maya. In this Greco-Roman Italic tradition, where the hero that is transpersonal, so it's archetypal. That in itself is what continues. So the example in the book, Kremmerz uses like a rose, a rose regrows itself every year, every spring. The petals die, the branches recede, so on and so forth. But the core, the sap, that never dies unless the withered roses don't grow again, unless you've withered your rose, you've possessed, or you've damaged your core being so much that it doesn't have a chance to rebirth. So this tradition believes, or one of the tenets is in reincarnation, but not reincarnation of the ego self or the historical self. It's understanding or trying to realize the numan, and the numan has its own name, which is archetypal. And the numan is once you've been able to peel this away, and you're typically in these astral zones where the past and the future combined. There isn't a linear progression of reality like we do in the somatic world, and that's where you can really get a sense of your innate self, those qualities and those energies or those forces. They call it fluids in this tradition that regenerate itself. So then you realize that you are this historical manifestation of this ancient soul, of this ancient source of light, which you're able to discern which are these innate qualities versus those you've picked up through societal influences.
Very Platonic and also very Egyptian, actually. The idea of the Ak, or the star, at the center of each being.
Book, yeah.
And it's also interesting, the Isis work, because in the Egyptian tradition, Isis is associated with the astral body, the Ba. And it has to, the initiation into the ECAC work and the Egyptian Hermetic mysteries had to do with learning how to leave the body, and which is, symbolized by the human-headed hawk. And what I hear you describing is so so aligned with what we know, at least to some degree, of what the mysteries of Isis were actually associated with in Egypt, at least as expounded by people like like Schwaller, DeLubis, and Jeremy Nadler, and and even the text, they were leaning on the text. But it's really interesting to me because you're describing a living tradition that is legitimately drawing on these interpretations.
And the question, or one of the challenges, once you're able to have these astral journeys and leave the body, like, what do you do with it? Like, what is the purpose of this? And in this tradition, it is about karmic repairs, at least at the Isaac or the lunar level. Is that we come into this world, unless we're avatars, as imperfect beings and with a purpose. And when you're able to enter into these transcendent states, typically in these astral environments, and you're able to identify, your inadequacies and what your strengths are, is an opportunity, given the what they call the sacral representations, or these dramas that occur, typically like in a dream state. They are all symbolic messages of where the growth is, and where how you react. And they say is that dying is you want to die when you're living, so when you die you live. That makes sense, because
Totally.
you're the ability to not only have lucid dreaming, to be aware that you're actually dreaming, but to be active in it, to be able to realize you're dreaming and understand the scenario based on the training you have, so you can reprogram yourself at a deeper level. So when you're back in this somatic world of the here and now of the 3 dimensions, you've made some really significant change, and you just don't go into reboot of how you typically act. So it's important in the astral framework to be able to pick up on these dramas or these scenes of these scenarios that are provided to you, to understand who you are at an interior person, the exterior person being the symptom or the outcome of these interior forces. So when you're in an astral, you're in a much more privileged manner to recognize or to see that your true self, but also because of the laws of the environment, it's much less dense. The atomic constituency of the astral world is much more open and mobile, flexible for change, and it provides you the tools, they being this school, to be able to make some of these karmic retributions or changes to your underlying self, to these transfigurations, which will lead to a transformation, which will lead to a much more holistic and a much more developed self in the existential dimension of who you are.
Super interesting. I mean, you talked about the mesmerism and the magnetism. I assume spiritism was in the mix as well.
Yeah, Kremmerz had a low opinion of spiritism. There was in the 1880s and 90s, when spiritism was very big, and Ouija boards and there were dens where there were seances would occur, and ectoplasm would be projected, and like apparitions, and Kremmerz was fine with that. He was just saying that at the end, people would go away and they would be odd, but they wouldn't change. And so, what is the purpose? It became like a Barnum and Bailey freak show.
Yeah.
So what Kremmerz was more interested in is in how to tap into this, into the secret world, into the occult world, to be able to use it for practical means. And this whole thing about Hermetic therapy is about the spirit. The spirit and the physical are all one. They're not separate entities. There is a unicum, and that the spirit is much more more expansive, and there's greater chance to affect the outcome or the physical world by making changes in the spiritual. And that the previous discussion that I mentioned, that all ties into that. It's the spiritual is much more attuned to be able to making profound change on the individual than in the physical. than going to a psychiatrist or making physical changes, which is helpful, but you really want to progress to another level. If you want to find who you really are, what your life purpose is, you need to go inside to get to be able to make those changes.
Mm-hmm. No, I really appreciate the focus on healing others almost exclusively. Of course, you mentioned the alchemical healing of yourself in that process as well. So, speaking of how this all works, and you did go into it a little bit, can you maybe elaborate on kind of the theory of how this healing takes place? You did mention that the chains, where there's lots of people kind of coordinating and focusing. But what's some of the underlying kind of metaphysics in addition to what you've already explained?
Yeah. So typically the process would be there's a hermetic chain of praying souls, and they practice a daily ritual and other rituals, including things such as fasting and other practices as well, which are more reserved. And it's basically to develop a purity, to go into this magical space where they can not only purify themselves, but let their inner self really come to the forefront, and to channel that energy. So there are specific convergences of doing collective rituals where energy from this deeper plane within the self, which is called the Miriam. The Miriam is a level of purity. Miriam, or Mary, is the redeemer of Lilith and of Eve. It's the matrix that gave birth to the Christ, to the divine child. So those are all metaphors of the individual practicer to arrive at that level of being that they can give birth to the divine child. And so this reservoir of energy is accumulated based on these hermetic practices. And in terms of the actual application, the patient would come to the request for healing must come from the patient. The healers are the Miriam, which is a collective order. Fraternity of Miriam, the fraternity or brotherhood refers to the human side. The Miriam refers to the divine side. So it's the merging of the human with the divine within, and the singular and collective level. The process, as I alluded to earlier, is the patient needs to approach a member and say that they are asked for their help, because they need to open up. There needs to be a convergence or a core that's developed between the Miriam, which is this collective purified energy, and the recipient. If not, then this, sort of like a Bluetooth, where you want to connect your cell phone to the, you need to be able to have this convergence. Without it, when we're talking about remote energy healing, then there won't be a convergence and you'll have sterile results. So there's typically that convergent point. And then a healer would, one of the masters, Miriams, would do a diagnosis. And typically a diagnosis is not only about the symptoms, but also about their karmic background, their family, when they were born, their influences, and so on, to get a profile to understand at the level of healing that is required. And then based on the archives of similar type of interventions and a prescription of rituals and other type of methods to be able to release the appropriate type of energy, the quality of energy, to help the individual. And there are basically three types of modalities of treatment. There's the positive, where the energy of the Miriam would actually be focused onto the ailment to destroy that ailment, if it was bacterial or viral. The second is an indirect, where the healing energies of the Miriam, of this divine source, of this sort of like what, like at Lourdes or Mecca or some of the other sanctuaries, people go there for miracles, and they're looking for indirect therapies where the energy would purify their body and provide the environment where their own body would nullify the morbus or the ailment that's afflicting them. So that's the indirect. The third is a mix where it combines both direct and indirect. So there's the direct convergence of this solar energy to kill the ailment, but also there's this healing energy to strengthen the afflicted, the exchange of vital energies that I talked about previously. So that in is a summary. There's much more details than that.
Sure.
It depends on treatments. So the calendar is very important. The Miriam used both the Chaldean calendar and Egyptian calendar. Chaldean is a lunar calendar, and Egyptian is a solar calendar. So depending on the type of energy or therapy required, whether it was a solar or direct or a lunar or indirect or both, and then they would consult the calendars to see the appropriate type of energy and the appropriate type of supplements that would be required in conjunction with the transference of energy. So it's very much a detailed and very much it's not like a faith healing. Kremmerz says this practice is not based on faith. It's based on empirical scientific evidence, even though it does enter into or tap into metaphysical dimensions.
Well, one of the prime indicators for me, besides the fact that there's an ancestral attraction to the work, but one of the prime indicators for me of authenticity is what you described with the Miriam, the actual the name Miriam and the meaning of Miriam. I mean, that's a primary. Whether you're talking about the esoteric or even Gnostic Christian understanding of it or the Egyptian understanding of it, it's the same thing when you drill down into it and come to understand it. It's like there's a book in the Nag Hammadi library, the Exegesis of the Soul, and it starts out with wise men of old gave the soul a feminine name, and indeed the soul is feminine, and it starts talking about how the soul is a womb and it's of a feminine nature, and that goes back to Plato talking about how the soul has to be purified of the impressions of the senses and turned within to become virginal again, to conceive the seed of God within it.
Beautiful, son. Well done. Yeah, well done.
And that's, I know the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, they also had this mystery, but they seem to have had some connection to the Miriam.
Yeah, I think it was through the Egyptian order. That was my sense. But I'm not an expert in the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor.
It's just intriguing to me that there's still, in fairly recent times, people practicing a spiritual science, really, the transfiguration of the soul. And because when you're talking about, Eve, the first wife of Adam, and then you talk about Eve, second wife of Adam, and then you're talking about Mary. It's a really profound mystery because you're talking not only about archetypal or divine figures who are self-existent and actual beings, but because they're also archetypal, they are prefigurations of states of our own soul, and the states that our soul can pass through from vulgarity to sacredness and I think that state, that transformative power of healing, it's such a profound mystery. And then when you bring in the mystery of Asclepius and the serpent, the healing serpent and the waters, I mean, all of these things, they all interconnect. They're all signifiers of a very specific Hermetic tradition.
I mean, the remnants are still visible today, even in conventional science, where you go outside any apothecary or pharmacy, and they have the caduceus, which is the famous wand of Hermes, and it all points back to this mystery tradition that we're talking about, this ancient healing tradition that was in many ways recedes back to prehistory, thousands of years.
It's incredible. It's like how on the Metternich stela it shows the child Harpocrates standing on the alligators and holding the poisonous scorpions and snakes in his hands as if they're harmless. And that's another signifier of the same tradition.
Yeah, I have in my book where how to describe or define Kremmerz, and there's a cipher in the Miriam, which is given to neophytes to understand or sort of to crack the code, where it goes something like this: that you describe Miriam, you can describe Kremmerz in these terms, that when the Maria is exalted, the two snakes of the caduceus begin to copulate and balance their energies, whereby the ibis rises and take flight. So that cipher, which was given as a means to crack for individuals to understand how this whole practice works, kind of summarizes what we're talking about. That the two serpents represent the two life forces that go around our spine, around the kundalini, the solar and the lunar, and to put them in balance. Because once you get them in balance, which means you reach a level of equilibrium, of balance, you're able to grow. You're able to open up to these insights, that things you previously didn't see. You're able to be conscious of the energetic component of life, that you're interconnected with everything but individual at the same time. So a lot of the contradictions are reconciled by really understanding some of these symbolisms and how they apply into everyday life, into the here and now.
It's really intriguing. I mean, that's the essence of the teaching of Thoth is balancing opposing forces and the maintenance of equilibrium and the harmony of the balance.
Yeah, exactly. And those forces are at the basis of creation. That that the vibrational current occurs when there's a positive current and a negative current, and they connect, and it creates. That's the root of being. And read astrophysics. It all comes down to that. There's a positive and a negative, whether it's in protons and ions and neurons and so forth. It all connects. It creates a synthesis. It goes from the monad to the dyad to the triad, and then the manifestation is with the tetrad. The Miriam studies takes you to the pentad, to the five, to fixing the root of that, which is the numan, and those are for advanced practitioners. But the symbolism all makes sense, and it's all practical today as it was 2,000 years or more ago, when some of these teachings were first started to get coded into texts and into manuscripts and so forth. Prior to that, it was all verbal. It was all done through sacerdotal brotherhoods and various communities that practice a spiritual life.
What's interesting is the similarities to, I see similarities to the Hindu Tantra, especially, or Indian Tantra, especially in Shaktism, and in, when we're dealing with the Kundalini, the balancing of the Ida and Pingala, the microcosm, macrocosm reciprocity, all of this, and the immanence and transcendence of the divine, rather than going to one or other of the two poles, as so many religious traditions try and do. The recognition of the interpenetration of them is, you see it in both traditions, and it's really interesting, because it lends credence to what you were saying about there being an underlying universality to these mysteries, even though they may have been expressed differently depending on the cultural matrix in which they arose within.
No, I totally support that point of view as well. It makes sense, and my research has affirmed that as well, without taking away the individuality or the uniqueness of various branches of tradition. Underlying all the various traditions or mystery schools, I think there's a commonality. It may different symbols, different wordings, but in the end, it kind of all lines up, and it all reaches back to a common root and the common symbolism and doctrines behind a lot of these different traditions and practices that have come to the forefront as being specific to a specific region or racial group or tribe or something like that. And in the end, it's like mathematics. 2 + 2 is 4, whether it's in China or Germany or America or Canada. So this is the universality and the inherent truth behind the manifestations of these traditions shows a commonality among various fronts, but again, without cheapening that they're that they're specific to a given time and era and people and so on and so forth. They're just, there's a lot of cultural appropriation, especially in New Age stuff, where everything gets whitewashed and mixed together, and it becomes like a bad salad or a bad soup. It's not what I think we're talking about. It's I think Genon or Shun said, there's a transcendent unity among various religions and various symbolism and traditions itself that focus on the unity of what's disparate, that they all can reconcile to a similar structure and a similar understanding, a similar logos.
Sure. I mean, truth is truth. And like you said, you put it very well. 2 + 2 is 4, no matter where you are in the world. And even with, you had mentioned, and in Kremmerz writings, he talks about karma and reincarnation, and you think, oh, well, that's very exotic, that's very Eastern, but you also see those things very plainly in Platonism as well. So
yeah, and especially in Pythagoreanism and even Orphism, the notion they're in the tablets, especially in southern Italy, of Orphics who talk about, so they would write these death tablets, these golden tablets, where these practitioners of Orphism would say, we'll see you next time, and it calls sister death, and next time I'll come back and you'll recognize me by the glimmer in my eye, or there's some distinction like that. So it's definitely not, reincarnation is not a doctrine that's not known to the West. It's just probably for the most part forgotten. Pythagoras wrote about the writings about Pythagoras was that he was a reincarnation of Apollo or of some other heroes as well. So and it was studied. It was studied in some of these mystery schools. It wasn't manifested to the public like some of the other philosophical teachings, because they were considered sacred, or it was, for initiates and not for the masses. Sorry.
Right. And I think that what you're saying is a good analogy for that is how there is a way that there is a certain manner after which certain gods are expressions of a henad or a godhead that expresses itself differently in adjacent cultures, like the famous Hermes Thoth. This is Hermes and Thoth at least during the period of Alexandria were pretty much recognized as being the same god, but that doesn't mean Hermes and Thoth are the same as Hephaestus. It's not. It's in the same way. I think we can say that like not all religions are the same, and they serve different functions. It's like there is a way in which certain things are similar or the same or execute the same function in different contexts, but that does not mean that all things are equivalent.
Yep, agree with that.
Kind of like the Isis and Mary thing. I mean, for those with eyes to see, it's this multi-level
and
mystery.
That archetype, the Marian archetype, has its versions in Buddhism, in the Green Tara, and in Hinduism as well. It's universal, and even in some of our Native American or Aboriginal as well. It's a very common archetype. So it's no single religion or tradition can take exclusivity or copyright on that. It's a concept. It's a symbol that has reverberates deeply, into the souls of humanity, not just into various subgroups of humanity. That's how I see it, gentlemen.
I like it. So, David, I want to go back to a word that you mentioned earlier. You said the F word, and I want to see if we can kind of dig into that a little bit more. Faith.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the four-letter word. What do you want to know about faith?
Yeah, about faith. So you seem
Dom?
to indicate earlier that there was not a place for faith. And is that right? Because
Well, let me contradict it and say there is a place, but
okay,
not
yeah.
where most people think it should be.
Explain.
Kremmerz warned against faith in accepting these practices, these rituals, these therapies on face value, just because he said it or another member of the Miriam said it. He says, no, be skeptical. Let evidence guide you. However, when you, as I talked about earlier, when for the healing energy, remote healing energy to work, for there to be a transmission, you need a rapport, a connection between positive channel, which is the healing chain, and the recipient, which is usually the ailing individual, and they need to open themselves up. If they're like, this is not going to work, they're totally negative, that brings out their lower astral or lunar selves. And that in itself, as we all know, anyone who's been sick, if you're miserable and you're just a son of a bitch, you tend to hold on to that sickness longer than if you're not being falsely positive, but being more proactive in being healed and being confident that you will. Confidence is the same thing. It's the same thing. So faith has its component that you're confident that you're open to this healing, but it shouldn't be the basis of the practice itself, because it just won't work.
I think we're talking about the contrast between blind faith and a leap of faith, or even faith informed by knowledge.
I mean, faith from the Latin word is fides, and it means that you can be faithful. That you comply, you enforce, you affirm a certain principle. But faith isn't fides if you're take everything I say as for God's honest truth, or for it's always going to be right, because I'm not. I know myself. I'm not. So that's the difference. It's getting to the root of the meaning, getting to the numan, the core of what fides means, and to be open to transference of energy, just like in with a woman with a sexual partner. You if you want to have like amazing sex, is you open yourself, both of yourselves open yourself up, and there's this transference. There's this component where it takes on its life of its own, and you have to be open to
absolutely
that.
And the heart has to be open.
Not
this
just
is
the
what
head
you just touched,
or not just the physical body. Heal me. If you
that's
don't,
one of my favorite
this
subjects.
is not going to work. I mean, I'll give you an example. Reiki. I've tried Reiki a number of times, and I'm open to it. It makes sense to me in theory. I haven't felt any difference. But I've had girlfriends who've tried it, and they come away and, I feel like a new person and this and that. So I take it for the word, but for me, it doesn't work.
Can you talk a little bit about, for our audience, I understand what you're talking, I'm sure Dom does too, but numan. Can we kind of drill down into numan and what that means in its original context and what it means in the context of the Miriam
work?
Sure,
the numan is a Roman term, ancient Latin term, and it represents the core being of each individual has a numan. So the equivalent would be like a soul, but it has much more depth and qualities associated than what we typically call a soul. So a numan in itself, for those who are alive, does not extinguish at death. That the numan itself is a individual monad, which means that it's a unique center of light within a greater spectrum of light. And this monad has both an unconscious, a dark side, and a light side, which is consciousness. So the more that you can convert your consciousness, the more you can convert your unconscious, your dark side, to your light side, the more that you're aware and you're able to act from the core of your being, from your numan. So the core, one of the purposes, one of the objectives of a man, of a vir. Vir was a nobleman in ancient Rome times, is to find your numan, is to discover your numan, and not just be an actor on the scene who just follows a crowd type of thing, the herd mentality. And there are techniques, they even do that in psychotherapy. A depth psychology is to understand or recognize your innate qualities. I have an affinity for the color blue. I like spicy food. I'm really good at drawing. These are the type of things that you may have discovered in yourself when you were younger that you didn't learn on itself, even though you can develop those things. But when you're able to acknowledge that there are qualities, that there are attributes about you that don't come from family or don't come from social conditioning, from education, those are the core of who you are. And the Romans had, for every individual, at least for the nobles, had 3 names. They had the individual name, Julius. They had the family name, say Caesar, and then they had the what they call the stripe, the stirrup name. That's your transpersonal or your numan name, and that was something you didn't give out, because those who knew your numan could have power over you, because they could go right to the source and have control you or know you as well. So that was something that you didn't give away slightly. So sort of, I guess, like what a mantra in some forms of Hindu spirituality, where you're given a mantra by the guru, and you're not supposed to share this mantra because it dilutes it and it becomes profaned and it decomposes. So a similar thing with the numan is that part of the purpose of your life purpose is to discover that numan and discover who you really are, not the historical self, but the spiritual self, the root of your being. It's sort of like in numerology, a prime number, a number that can't be divisible, that's unique on its own, like 3 or 5 or 7. It's not a composite number like 9 or like any of the whole numbers like 2 and 4 and so on and so forth. So understanding is to develop who you are by recognizing your numan. And some people never do that, and they're not able to crack that code to get to the core of who they are by separating things that are creations versus those true spiritual currents, that ascendant path, that comet, that mercurial light that defines who they are as a body of light within this greater cosmos of light.
And so in the context of this greater conversation, would you say that this realization of the numan, or this knowing of the numan, is a prerequisite to becoming a healer?
Not necessarily, because I think the knowing the core of who you are is at a much deeper level. When we're talking to Miriam, those healing powers, those occur at the lunar level, and you can still continue with your search, which is at the solar level. So the Miriam follows a traditional classification of individuals based on the 4 hermetic bodies. The lower one is the Saturnian, which is the somatic or physical. The sublimation of that is the lunar one, which is the Mary part, which is associated with your emotional centers. Then the mercurial is your intelligent, and the solar is your divine. Is that core eternal being that lives at a deeper plane. And this, I mean, it's in reality, it's not like that. It's pedagogical ways to understand that we're multiple dimensions and we have different layers of the cells. In reality, all these different components, these different bodies, they're interpenetrable.
Mm-hmm.
So the solar is manifested in your physical body, and the mercurial, the intelligent, in your emotional or in your humoral self as well. It's all we're all one. Energy is all energy, but there are various levels. So just sort of like the musical scale, you've got the do re. It goes higher from a lower pitch to a higher pitch, but it's all part of the musical scale of sound.
Interesting. And relating back to what we were talking about a second ago about faith, there's this receptivity that sounds like that needs to be present in the person who's being healed. And it's very reminiscent for me in esoteric Japanese Buddhism. You have a term called it's kaji, and it's essentially empowerments. You have people talking about empowerments in Tibetan Buddhism, but you have to have that receptivity and the grace, essentially, from the Buddha, or in the case of the healer. You can't have just one or the other. There has to be kind of that porous ability to accept the healing.
So on that note, so Kremmerz writes about the state of mag, where the healer, the Miriam practitioner, needs to develop. And the state of mag is a state of love, not love in the sentimental or personal, I love you, you love me, or I'm in love with this girl, but love is this universal force, something like, like gravity or something like that. It's a universal force, and that in itself is connected at this lunar level, at this Mary level. And that is the medium through which this connection, this transmission of these healing energies is most propitious. And both parties, both the healer, the transmitter, and the receiver, need to connect at that level for there to be a successful or a propitious transference of overabundance of energy to those who are lacking, who are imbalanced.
Yeah.
So very much love as a force, as a energy to cultivate within oneself, to be able to project this energy, to be able to heal it, to be able to use it in practical terms, and without being lost. Because some people get into a delirium, and that's not divine love. That's more eros, and that's more crazy love, which we're talking about not being in a state of balance. So Kremmerz calls it a state of mag as free love. So love that where the practitioner is in a state of love, but he's not absorbed or he's not possessed by the love.
Interesting.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
would you consider this type of work theurgic rather than thaumaturgic?
That's a good question. I think there are elements of both, to be honest. And again, based on the so Kremmerz writes about both natural magic and divine magic, with the thaumaturgic, depending on the type of therapy that's required, the direct, indirect, or mixed. And then where in cases that require theurgic, where some of these entities, these aeons, are coerced to release some of their energies, where the conditions are required.
And what about this this term that I caught in your book? It's a principle of valorization. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so that's a practice that more advanced therapists would or hermeticists would develop. And Izar, or Kremmerz's first master, was renowned for having this quality of valorization. So valorization, or value, is the ability to transmit virtues, qualities of energies based on the 7 spectrums of universal light onto an object or onto a being, to be able to to use that as a supplement for healing. So, for example, the example provided in the book, and it's taken from one of Kremmerz's, one of the texts that are most reserved, is called the Corpus, and he brings the example when Kremmerz was very young and he was walking along a beach with his master Izar, and he asked his master for a cure for his insomnia, for the fear of night, for not sleeping. And the Izar picked up a shell from the beach, a triangular shell, and he looked at it and he did something to it, and he gave it to Kremmerz and said, "Here, take this, keep this by your side at night, and you won't have trouble sleeping or fearing the night." And Kremmerz thanked his master, and he goes, will this work through self-suggestion? And Izar said, no, because even if you don't believe that this stone, this shell will cure you, will release you, it will, because my will's impregnated in it, is imprinted on it. So transvalorization is the ability of the of the adept to imprint their will, their virtues on an object, and to have that object to transmit that energy at a distance. And again, it's very few had that ability to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure Kremmerz did, because there are testimonies or examples how he would valorize various types of vegetable and mineral based supplements that he would give to sick individuals to help them to heal.
That's interesting, because you do see, consecrations and blessings of talismans and amulets and stuff, but oftentimes it's you're bringing in a spirit to inhabit the amulet, or maybe like an astrological ray, you're in the right timing for Venus or something, but not necessarily the actual magician's intention.
Yeah, and to what extent the transmission of the virtue is coded or based on the adept's will versus the harnessing of these transpersonal energies, one of these 7 hermetic rays.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a fine line. That's is to explain where one ends and the other begins. My sense is that the adept has the ability, based on his knowledge of the interaction of the harmonia mundi between the macrocosm and the microcosm,
sure,
to be able to channel these energies, and through their synchronicity, or something called syzygy, to be able to transmit that. But whether they in themselves have that capacity, probably not, because the amount of energy that needs to be transmitted is beyond the capability of individuals. But their ability to tap into that is something else.
Well, that goes back to the idea of the soul and the soul womb, and it's, if the soul is made virginal in the Platonic sense, and it can become receptive to the celestial principles, become impregnated by them, and then act as a conductor, into the telesmata, and impregnate them with magnetic force, and enliven the talisman as really a medial principle, as an intermediary principle between the cosmic and the local.
And the teachings tell us that at an unconscious level, there's a connection, there's a unicum among souls and the spirit, and that energy can be transmitted and then filtered through the unconscious of the healer or the adept, and then through their consciousness to be able to harness and project that out for the purposes that are required in the event that they choose to be involved with.
And is this something that Kremmerz did in his later years? I want to say that
I think he had these powers. So there are a number of different, and it's written about in the book, powers that he had. one of this valorization that you brought up, Dom, that we talked about. The other is this telepathy, where he instituted a telepathic healing box. So in the later parts of Kremmerz's life, he lived in southern France, just outside of Monaco, and most of his academies or the chains of Miriam were based in Rome or Naples or in Bari in Apulia in the southern part of Italy. So at certain hours, he would converge through this telepathic box messages from the authorities of the various academies. They would send these messages to him, and he would pick them up to telepathically, and then send through telegrams what the cures were, because the masters didn't have that telepathic ability that Kremmerz had to receive, or else he would have sent the remedies or the therapies that he recommended to them telepathically. The recipient parties didn't have those capabilities. So he had a lot of those qualities he developed as a young man. He spent a lot of time in developing spagyric alchemical remedies as well. Besides the magnetism, of the story around Kremmerz is when he was after his master died, he was assigned to some Hermetic colleges in southern France. One of them, I think, was with Pappas, who was a very renowned Martinist, and where he learned some of these techniques of mesmerism and magnetizing. And he was quite advanced in that as well. So he had a very broad knowledge and application of the various Hermetic arts. And it's just not just with healing, that even though he himself, I think his vocation in life was to be a healer, he did study in Argentina, received a degree in conventional, actually in homeopathy. So he was considered a licensed doctor in that practice. But his therapies, as we've talked about, encompass much more than your common remedies that were available at that time. But he believed that they shouldn't be exclusive. Where it made sense is to combine. I mean, he took very much a patient's perspective. I mean, you just want to get them healed. Not important how you do it. So he was very much unique and probably way ahead of his time, because most doctors, like most professions, if the only tool in their box is a hammer, then everything looks to them like a nail, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas Kremmerz was much more open and much more flexible in his trying to understand the correlation between illness and health, and how you can change one state to the other.
So there's a pragmatism there.
Yeah, very much pragmatic.
There's two things I want to mention. I want to touch on while we still have a little bit of time left. The first is, you mentioned also looking into the root causes of illnesses. And I'm assuming when we're talking about illness, we're not even necessarily just talking about physical illness, but probably also emotional illness.
Yeah, no, we're looking at what the topic, I think, when you were away, Janice, that Dom and I were focusing on is in the numan, and it's basically what the individual's predisposition is. So in their incarnation, what was their predisposition? And I know Marco Daffy had indicated that he was missing in his third element, his lunar body. It was, to use a bad analogy, badly made, and that for him to get wholeness, to exceed to a more higher incarnation in a future life, is that he had to repair his third body, which meant he needed to find his feminine complement, both in the physical sense and in an internal sense. Because he was pretty advanced solar and mercurial and saturnial. He came from a very rich family, like one of the richest families in Italy. with huge possessions of farmlands and etc. But he was missing his psycho-emotional component was out of whack with his other parts of his body, and for him to make his life worthwhile, he had to correct that, and that was his life mission.
And that leads me to the other half of that question, which is, at the beginning of this interview, you mentioned briefly the root causes of certain illnesses being karmic. And if you look at the whether we're looking at the Buddhist or the Hindu understanding, that's ultimately has to do with the mind. Now, when I say the mind, I don't necessarily mean the discursive, rational, analytical intellect, but the deeper mind holding the samskaras, the root causes that produce karma, being in these deep areas of the mind, being karmic traces from prior incarnations. Does this Hermetic Therapeutics address these root causes in the causal body?
I think that's the whole basis of our discussion. Example would be, if a patient comes to you and they have a problem with alcoholism, conventional treatment is, you go to Betty White and you practice abstinence, and you drink all that. Now you make these external changes in your life, and hopefully you'll get better. And a lot of times you don't. The Hermetic looks at what the predisposition to alcoholism. So it's a question of it's not the alcohol the problem, it's the root cause is addiction. Why you have an addictive personality in the first place? What is lacking? Because we are mirrors of the divine, and we are meant to be born whole, not lacking anything. And that's part of the whole lessons of the whole fall of mankind, is that we've fallen into this state of relativity, but we have the tools to reintegrate back into our divine core, which is the numan, which is the core of who we are at a pre-manifested state. So looking at what are the predispositions, or those innate qualities that lead one to have that predisposition for being addicted, never mind whether it's alcohol or whatever your addiction is, and looking at things, looking at the profile of the individual from multiple levels, from astrology, from generational or family type of issues, the environment you're in, and looking at various traces. We talked about earlier how even Freud mentioned it, is these Freudian slips, is to understand who the real self is trying to get out, is being aware of those type of symbols to be able to put together this more in-depth profile of what's causing, or the root cause of the addiction, and then dealing with the various therapies that one has at one hand based on one's study to come up with the appropriate means to cure, to remedy the deficiencies underlying the physical symptoms. That's what we're talking about.
Now, if you scrutinize the Hermetic scriptures, such as the Kore Cosmu, the Asclepius, the other Hermetica, it's said here and there, and it's implied in many places, that after the initial catechetical and purificatory degrees, you have to be able to externalize the astrosome in order to be able to enter into contact with the degrees of the order that are on the astral plane. And would you say that the Miriam is in continuity with that idea, that there is a astral component to the order that's only accessible through after the purification has occurred, that enables a person to enact the separation between the bodies?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I'm not sure what the question is. The question is does that follow? Is that similar to? Yeah, I think that there are some similarities, or there are some congruences with that, without that being the core goal. I think in some orders like the Golden Dawn, where you converge with the masters, and that indicates a certain level of adepthood and so forth. I'm not aware that is the case with the Miriam. I think it's more about when you master these lunar or Isaic initiation, you're ripe for Osirian type of initiation, which have more of an inner alchemical component. The aeonic component of being in conference with other non-physical entities is more at the Miriam or lunar stage of things, where the initial sign of initiation or being able to go inside yourself, to get outside of yourself, is you have these contacts. And we talked about earlier, I don't know if you were here, the ability for it to identify who you are in these astral planes, and not subcuing to being absorbed into that greater environment, or being possessed and so forth, and being recognizing the various aeonic entities at that level and being able to harness them is part of the maturity and the that whole maturation of the inner self of your whole vocation, your spiritual vocation.
That would also translate to the after death state then, because if you're able to solidify and maintain continuity of consciousness while in the flesh, then once you exit the flesh, continuity of, which is a very Egyptian idea, the idea.
Yeah. So they talk about the fifth element is that you fix your core. So as you passage from one state to the other, the somatic to the astral, it could be a dream state, it could be some state of ecstasy, is that you still recognize who you are at the core. You don't lose that connection. And that in itself is a preparation for a post-mortem awakening. So we talked about earlier that at the core of the numan, at the core is the monad, and the monad is both. It's a dyad. It's dyadic. So there's the black side or the unconscious, and the white side or the conscious side. So sleeping, you enter into the black side, and then you have your moment where you wake up in a dream, and you're able to realize in your dream and act and still identify with who you are. So that's where the white, that you're all part of that same monad, is that light has transitioned from the unconscious to the conscious. That's that passage occurs at the post-mortem as well. There's a component when you die that your residue, you separate from your physical body, and that slowly fades away in time. But it doesn't die out. It's just that convergence or passage from the white monad to the dark. And then that will precipitate at the right time into a new incarnation without losing the awareness, the memory of your previous incarnation, because that white or the conscious part is latent within the unconscious, and that dyadic component makes up the monad of who you are as a numan.
Very well said. That's. I mean, to me, that seems crucial, especially say for someone like Kremmerz, whose whole agenda is to be an instrumentality of healing and a benefit for others. It would enable you to continue that work, that good work.
Yeah, and to recognize when you fall asleep or you lose conscious, it's not the end and be all. That core is there as a monad, and provided that you've done so, it's not available to it. The difference is it's not that needs to be cultivated. That those techniques of memory recall, of identification with who you really are, that builds the core. That builds a very tight knit center that doesn't dissolve in sleep or doesn't dissolve in death. It may become latent, and when the right time to precipitate, it will germinate into the white light or the consciousness. And given that you've had the strength in memory and past life recall in recognizing your innate self, that will come back to you. There are signs that one gets, that we all get, that indicate of who we really are, of that perpetual qualities that we are the basis of each one of us individually.
Truly profound. It really puts a very, to me, it takes a lot of this work also. Everything we've discussed here takes a lot of this work out of the, Western esotericism, whether intentional or not, often is so theoretical. It's often so cerebral and theoretical. And this is exactly what you're talking about is a lived, when we really get to the roots of what the word therapeutic even means in the original, the therapeute and the, it brings a lived, genuine, it's a path, it's a way rather than
and that's well said, Janice. And where the healing helps is that if you're able to detect these innate qualities in your patient, then it helps to reconfirm what to look for in yourself. So we all have these predispositions. We don't come here on a clean slate. We have these predispositions that take us on different routes. We do make these life changes. We do influence, but we have these predispositions. And to understand, to really separate what our spiritual being is from our social being, the two may not be the same thing, helps us to understand what is the perpetual versus what is more the contingent. And there are aspects that we can develop on our innate self to add another layer so that can be reincarnated, that it can be developed in a future life or even in this life. It's not very much a static. It's not based on fate that you're born this way and you gotta die this way and you're taking that with you. No, consciousness provides you with the tool and the mindset to understand where you are, but also based on your vocation, that transpersonal self, that what he talked about before, that stripe that we have, that archetype, to be able to give us these guidelines in terms of where we want to go as well.
It's like the Bodhisattva vow. I mean, you're vowing to be reborn as a Bodhisattva, and that's your choice. And, you are going to work towards that, and that's kind of your path from that point on.
Yeah, like the Bodhisattvas is that they take that vow, is that, that healing is their job isn't done until every sentient being is healed. Mm-hmm. And part of what this teaching of the Miriam tells you is that the growth or evolution is eternal. There's no like you reach one pinnacle and hey, I made it. It's eternal. It's beyond finite limitations, which is to me one of the most inspiring things aspect of it. And there are other elements such as the avatar that I'm going to get into my next book, where so we're talking about here is the tetradic monad. So the monad is the numan, and it has this dyadic component of the unconscious and the conscious. And the conscious manifests into the four Hermetic bodies. The Saturnian, which is more the physical, the lunar, which is more the humoral or emotional, the mercurial, the intelligence, and the solar, which is the divine. So most of us are incarnated as this tetrad, and most of us identify with the physical self. Some of us who are more advanced have emotional intelligence, and the really advanced are the geniuses and so forth that are have this mercurial. But what we need to do is reintegrate that to our monad, to who we really are and what our purpose and vocation. That's sort of like that's sort of like my understanding of how this process works for incarnate beings. However, there's other class of beings called avatars that instead of being tetradic monads are monadic tetrads. What does that mean? Is that they're incarnated as avatars, so as these divine beings. They already have at birth this understanding, or this knowledge, and this being of consciousness of who they are, and that is manifested in each of those different hermetic bodies. So instead of like working from the bottom up, which is what most of us do, works from the top down. And those are those Buddhas and Jesus Christ that, are on here for a mission. They're born divine, and they're communicating this light through mercurial, lunar, or even at the Saturnian level to raise the vibrational consciousness, the frequency higher.
So let's talk a little bit about your next project. Let's talk a little bit about what's on the horizon for you now, because
I've got a next book working with I don't know how much this I can give away, with the same publisher. It's another translation of Daffy with a lot more introduction and prologue for myself. It's the working title is called the Sirene, or the Siren, and it basically talks about that as the Siren is a hybrid creature, half human and half fish, so half in the somatic world and half in the lunar world, and in the astral world, or the astral sea, and its ability to take the freedom and the powers from that astral to manifest it in the Saturnian, the existential world, but also as part of the task, as I mentioned earlier, is to reconcile the deficient lunar part, the fish part. The fish is understood as a symbol for a state of being that lives like aeons in the astral sea, but which is also connected to the physical self. So that's why Marco Daffy is a pseudonym, which is his Syriac, or is his lunar name, and is the name he was born with. His Saturnian name is Baron Ricciardo Ricciardelli. And each plane of being has a different level of consciousness, which has a name associated with that. So that's all part of that tetradic monad, is to reconcile or reintegrate each of your tetradic cells into your monad to reach wholeness and to be the person you were meant to be. So that's part of the next. So they'll be full of documentation and doctrines. It's going to be exploration of the alchemical hermetic of explorations in alchemical hermeticism. We talked about various doctrines and practices to be able to achieve that, to be able to realize your lunar self and the aquatic cells, to be able to funnel that down, cascade that down in the Saturnian level, to increase your mind, your ability to call on knowledge and practices and virtues that aren't available at the somatic level.
Intriguing. I know I speak for Dominic as well when I say we would love to have you back on the show when that book's getting.
Awesome,
we want to have another deep dive with you.
This has been awesome. You guys are really great guys, and enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we'll have many more.
Cool, man.
Really nice to meet your acquaintance.
We have to do this again. It's a must.
For sure, man. It's great to be on the same wavelength that you're going to have these conversations. It's not what I usually have when I go to the bar.
Right.
With my buddies. Not what we get onto.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, guys. Take care.
Okay, that was David Pantano. David's doing some really important work translating barely known Italian esotericists. The order of Miriam seems to have roots going back all the way into the Alexandrian fraternities. We know that the cult of Isis existed for a very long time in the Naples area, which is of personal interest to me since I have ancestry going back there. There was a temple unearthed right at the base of Vesuvius to Isis, I believe. And I know that in Naples downtown, they found underground, when they were doing road renovation, they found an entire intact temple to the god Mithras. So in that area of Italy, the southern part of Italy, the mysteries were active for a very long time. So the claims that the Order of Miriam and even the Egyptian Freemasonry of Cagliostro, the Memphis Mizraim, the claims that the Egyptian tradition continued, they're really not that unusual, especially considering the natural conservatism of Italian culture and the way that Italian culture tends to preserve all kinds of archaic traditions. And we could have a episode exploring that would have to be several parts just to get into all of the different vestigial remnants of esoteric and pre-Christian elements in Italian culture.
Right. And yeah, I also enjoyed the connections that David was able to make. At least for me personally, I felt like he was able to bring together the different eras of Hermetic thought and practice. And it's kind of a theme, like, I don't know that we intentionally did this, but a lot of our episodes lately are kind of hanging around in the same general area. So we've got the surrealists who were really heavy in the late 1800s into the, early 1900s. That was kind of a big period for them. And then we just covered G.R.S. Mead, who was active during that same period. We had an episode a while ago about Peladon, who would also fit into that. And even the Finnish occult episode we did, a lot of that took place in this general time period. So there was a lot going on, and it's interesting to flesh it out to better know where we're at now.
Yeah, it was a really fertile time. And the thing I like about the work that David's doing is he's really relating it to a more general or more genuine Hermetism. The things that Kremmerz was drawing on, you can tell by the characteristics of the paradigm, of the practices, of the orientation, of even the language being used. We're not dealing with the English, sort of Golden Dawn synthesis and everything derived from that, nor are we dealing necessarily with the French flowering that occurred, which I love, Sadir, Papou, and all of Stanislas de Gaida, Peladon, all of those, Gerard de Nerval, all of those folks are amazing. But when you're dealing with the Italian tradition, as Pantano is explicating it, being somebody who has studied those ancient sources, you can see that this is more truly representing the Hermetic tradition as it would have been practiced and understood in that area of the world 2,000 years ago. It seems more consistent with that. Whereas when we're using the term Hermetic in context of the English or the French branches or even the Russian branch, you're dealing with something very different. You're dealing with the term Hermetic being applied to a sort of synthetic spirituality with esoteric characteristics. But properly taken, Hermetism has very, very definite identifiable marks, which connected to the mystery cults of late antiquity, the high temple culture of Egypt, and the magical synthesis that occurred in Alexandria.
And David was a delight to have on. Like he obviously thinks very deeply about these subjects, and I really appreciated his openness and his candor and his humor. Yeah, very enjoyable conversation.
He was such a pleasure to speak with. It was great to have him on.
All right, so what do you got for the book segment this week?
Well, what do I got for the book segment, aka what do I have? So I want to give a real shout out to an independent publisher of all kinds of very interesting esoteric books called Rose Circle Publications. Rose Circle puts out books on Martinism, on the Elu Cohen tradition, on esoteric Freemasonry, and all kinds of other allied and related topics. It is primarily run by Piers Vaughn, who, if you don't know the name, you should. He is a luminary of our current time and a legend, and is somebody who has really contributed immensely to the Western esoteric tradition in our time. Piers translated a book called The Science of the Kabbalah by Lazar Lanane, and this is also called The Art of Knowing the Good Geniuses. It was originally published in 1823, and Piers has translated it from French into English. This is an extremely useful little book. It is inexpensive as well. I don't know the exact price, but if you go on Amazon, you may be surprised at how affordable it is. This is the first translation into English of this book on the Shem HaMephorash. The Shem HaMephorash is the 72-letter name of God known from the practical Kabbalah. Now, this 72-letter name of God is permutated through Kabbalistic means into 72 different angels, or 72 geniuses. And so each person is born under one of these geniuses, but these geniuses also relate to seasons, hours, and they also preside over different areas of life. So Lanane provides a simple method to identify the three geniuses which rule over one's life and the description of the sacred calendar. This knowledge can be used in a variety of ways, from talismans to planning travel and avoiding pitfalls. Additionally, Piers himself, because there were omissions in the information needed to create talismans, Piers provided a number of appendices with alternate seals and sigils, including, in addition to this, 72 of the angelic seals devised by Eliphas Levi and private notes to one of his students, the Baron Spedalieri. Some might be familiar with him. It's a really useful book. It's primarily a practical book, and anyone interested in this kind of magic will find this to be indispensable. Piers himself is a lifelong student of the esoteric and the theosophical paths. He's a very prominent Mason in the New York area. He's lectured across the United States and Europe and all over the place. And he's really one of the seminal figures in the resurgence of interest in Freemasonry as a path of spiritual awakening and esoteric insight. He translates a lot of material from the French Martinists, and he has translated works by Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and many others. You can find these works under Rose Circle Books, www.rosecirclebooks.com. Many of the works of Rose Circle are also on Amazon. I strongly recommend this Lazar Lanane book if you're interested in experimenting with working with these angels. They are very helpful. And then also, if you're interested in Kabbalah and practical Kabbalah, this is a neat book too, because it gets into a good amount of that as well.
Nice. Thank you. What's the name of the book again?
The name of the book is The Science of the Kabbalah by Lazare, L-A-Z-A-R-E, Lanane, L-E-N-A-I-N. And it includes the preface by Papu to the 1909 edition.
Awesome. Cool, man. Well, thank you for doing that. And if you don't have anything else, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We appreciate you, as always. Feel free to find us on all the different platforms, etc. And we'll see you in the next episode.